My name is Adil Najam. I am the director of the Frederick S. Pardee Center for the Study of the Longer Range Future here at Boston University, and also a professor at the Departments of International Relations and the Department of Geography and Environment. It's my great pleasure to be here at this very timely and very wonderful conference, and I will be your moderator for this, the second panel of the day. Vivian just told me that it is today Europe Day, so I don't know what the traditional greeting for Europe Day is, but welcome to Europe Day and happy Europe's Day. If you haven't sent a flower to Europe yet, please do so before they run out because of Mother's Day tomorrow. But welcome all. We are going to be continuing the very interesting discussion from this morning. A lot of these issues are really intertwined, and you'll see them coming up again and again throughout the day. But the specific focus of this, the second panel, is the end of cheap food and geopolitics. And I have always thought that sort of if the last year we didn't have the oil price fluctuations the way we did, if that hadn't been the big news really would have been the food price, the hike in food prices and the food crisis that we weren't all talking about, but we really should have. And there's probably a difference between the two, because oil prices have come down much more than food prices have, and the food crisis, at least it seems to me, is far from over. I don't think the oil crisis is over either. But the question of food didn't really get as much attention, I think, globally last year as it should have gotten, partly because of everything else happening there. The three wonderful panelists we have may or may not agree with that, but that's the context, or one of the contexts in which we want to have this panel. There are a number of important questions related to the geopolitics, both the past geopolitics and the future geopolitics of food. And that includes issues of competing claims, for example, between food and fuel. That includes issues of food price. That includes issues of food availability. That includes issues of food security. That includes issues of food sovereignty. That includes food security at national levels, food security at individual levels. So we have a full plate here, pardon the pun, and we are going to delve right into it with three wonderful panelists, each of whom have agreed to talk for about 15 minutes, after which we hope to have a discussion and open it to the audience. I'll only briefly mention the three panelists, and after the first one, we'll all sit on the stage because the first one is using the PowerPoint. Our three panelists are Benny Haerlin, or Benedikt Haerlin, from the Foundation on Future Farming and Save Our Foods. He will be going first. After that, we will have Tim Weiss, who is the Director of Research and Policy Programs at GDE, the Global Development and Environment Institute at Tufts University. And finally, we will have Jim Harkness, who is the President of the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy. So we have three people who have very deep insights on this, and without any further ado, let me ask Benny to launch us off on the panel. Benny, all yours.
Thank you very much. Greetings from Europe. I can assure you nobody in Europe is aware that today is Europe Day. Don't get this for anything like 14th of July. To briefly introduce myself, I'm working for the Foundation on Future Farming, which in Germany puts about €1 million per year into developing seeds, new seeds for organic purposes. So this is one of my backgrounds. You'll hear after lunch a little more about my background on genetic engineering and fighting GMOs in Europe. What I will be talking about this morning is cheap food for whom, what are the expenses of cheap food to the people and to the environment, and finally I will try to merge this with a little bit of propaganda for an uncomfortable and therefore a little bit forgotten report which I had the honor to participate in, which has the very short name of International Assessment of Agricultural Knowledge, Science and Technology for Development, or briefly IASTD, and which has been an exercise over 5 years initiated by the World Bank, by all major UN agencies, asking how can we sustainably fight hunger and improve rural livelihoods over the course of the next 50 years by looking also back to the past 50 years. And there have been around 580 authors, experts from academia as well as from the field, mostly academia, I must say, which have been selected, and that has been a bit revolutionary for a UN exercise like this, by a so-called multi-stakeholder bureau, which was composed of 30 government representatives on one side and 30 civil society representatives, which stretched from consumers representatives, private sector, including Syngenta, Unilever, BASF, big companies. Some of them unfortunately dropped out last minute because they didn't like the findings after 5 years. And NGOs such as Women for Sustainable Development, Greenpeace, which I initially represented there, Friends of the Earth, Pesticide Action Network, and others. And it was a really very lengthy process. The authors presented a first draft for public review and discussion, and then after taking all the recommendations into account, they published a second draft, which was again reviewed, and then finally they came to conclusions, which are roughly 2,000 pages, one global report and 5 regional assessments, and which have been signed by 58 governments, unfortunately not including the United States, Canada, and Australia, which have been participating intensively in the whole process, but finally felt that, probably also given that CropLife International, which is the biotech and agrochemical lobby umbrella organization, had dropped out of the process, it was not balanced enough to their taste. However, I should say it is probably the most comprehensive, and the both as regards the stakeholder involvement and also the interdisciplinarity of academia involved in this, the most advanced exercise we've ever seen on agriculture in this context. Of course, the big question at the beginning and the end was how to end hunger, and I've brought you a hunger map of the world, which shows that about 63.9 to be exactly of the people going hungry live in Asia. The worst hunger, as you probably know, is presently in sub-Saharan Africa, and still 5.3% are in Latin America, a region which produces 3 times as much food as it consumes, actually. And you're probably familiar with the fact that about 1% of the hungry in the world actually live in God's own country, in the United States of America. At the same time, as we are now reaching 1 billion hungry in the world, roughly the same number of people, 1 billion, is suffering from obesity. And this is a map of obesity that is drawn up by the WHO. And it shows that this is by no means just an industrialized country's problem. It is especially a problem in emerging economies. I would call it an urban problem predominantly, while hunger is mainly a rural problem, so to say. So more than 70% of the people considered hungry live in rural areas next to the food, actually. And another figure which does not show up too well is that between the left column is 1990 and the right green column is 2001. The availability of calories, I mean, these are all global figures to be taken with the necessary reservations on Excel charts in general, of course. The availability of food in the poorest countries of the world, that is Eritrea, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Burundi, Tajikistan, and the exception in this left part is Ethiopia, has actually decreased over the past decade, while in countries such as the US, Portugal, Austria, Poland, Greece, which are representing the richest part of the world, the availability has increased well above any considerable need. So these are the trends that lead to the fact that despite the fact that we've never been producing as much food, and despite the fact that there is an overproduction of agricultural produce in the world, the number of people who go hungry is constantly increasing since 5 years now. And I think one of the conclusions we have to draw from this is it is a social agreement in most of the societies where hunger prevails that this was acceptable. It is not a problem of technology. It is not a problem of not being able to produce enough food. And as the title is cheap, the end of cheap food, what I'm trying to show you in this little chart is how much of their disposable income people spend worldwide on food. At the very bottom, it's probably not visible for all of you. You see the United States of America with 6.9% of the income spent on food. And on the very top, you have the Democratic Republic of Congo, where presently about 70% of the income is spent on food. In between, you can see Germany, for instance. In the middle, Turkey, Brazil, Mexico, Chile, where more or less 25% of the income is spent on food. This is the mean. This is a mean which allows for sufficient nutrition and does not allow for massive overnutrition on average, right? You have to keep in mind these are all figures on average, and they represent big disparities among the societies which have this average. And I would like to share with you how this food looks in different areas. This is an example from Chad, a refugee camp where $1.23 has to nourish this family. This is an example of Bhutan, where with $5, this family can actually lead a healthy life. I think it is important to recognize that it does not necessarily mean being below a poverty line of $2 that you lead a miserable life. And it has been the special initiative of the king of Bhutan, actually, when the World Bank came and told him that his people were suffering from terrible poverty and needed progress now, that he said yes, he agreed, and he was willing to look at this. However, he had found out that the gross national product, which the World Bank uses as the benchmark for the wealth of the people, would actually not be the appropriate benchmark for his people, because he found out that the GNP and the happiness of the people had no direct relation. So since more than 5 years now, and Helena, who has spoken here before, has been deeply involved in this, there has been now an initiative to actually measure and benchmark a global happiness or a gross national happiness product. Now, oops. This is Mali, where hunger prevails at a high percentage. This is Ecuador, where you also have a lot of hunger, but you see this food is enough to nourish the people depicted. India, Mongolia, even at $40 you can have quite a bit of meat if your culture demands. Turkey, China. This is the typical, most of these pictures are actually from urban families, right? And here you see the change, more wrapped food, and this is what about 1/6 of the world is eating today. Italy, Kuwait, all wrapped, all imported. Japan, the US, one way. And finally, humble as I am, the worst appear to be Germany. This comes from a wonderful book for all of you who have not seen this yet. Highly recommended. It's called Hungry Planet. And I think it gives us an impression what cheapness of food can mean in different cultures. And this is not the real problem. Also not the real problem is underproduction, as I said. This is the latest figures from the FAO, the World Food Organization, which shows how cereal production over the past 6 years, roughly, has been continuously increasing. But what happens with these cereals? On average, all cereals taken into account, less than 50% of the cereal production of the world is directly used for food. The other big chunk is feed, and then there is this conglomerate of other uses. The bulk of other uses is energy uses, fuel, heating, and so on and so forth. For wheat, you see it's still 70%. Coarse grains, which is mainly corn, only 17% are consumed as food, actually. Rice, most of it is. This is an addition. When we look at the overall bulk commodities, we have to keep soybeans in mind, oilseed, and there again, around 70% is not used for food. And this is the prediction of the FAO for the outlook of this year's agricultural production, which says the overall production will increase by 5%. And at the very bottom, this will yield an 0.1 increase of more food availability worldwide, notwithstanding how that is then distributed. This is a sick system. If we want to continue to augment food availability at a ratio of 5 to 0.1, it is obvious we will not be able to feed ourselves. And the main reason behind that, you all know that probably, is the increase of meat consumption. On the left side, you see how much kilogram per capita, on average again, worldwide are consumed. The blue columns are our industrialized countries. The yellow columns are the developing countries, and the brownish one is the average. And that results in an increase between 1963 and 2003 from around 80,000 to 250 million tons per year. This cannot go on, and even though I have to admit that also even the IASTD does not fully spell this out politically, is the key to solving our food problems in the future. We must reduce our meat consumption. And I found this when I was researching recently. It's a title of Time magazine, and it's from April 1973. So it is not that we would not know about this since quite some time. And the other burden on our food availability from a global perspective is the emergence of agrofuels. It is the conclusions of the IASTD are quite clear, and this is probably an agreement today with most international agencies, that agrofuels are environmentally and socially not acceptable at this moment and the present state of technology, that fuel production must not replace food production, and this is a real threat. We'll be hearing more about this from other speakers, I hope. When you look at present trends of land grab, of buying large areas of land abroad for fuel production purposes, and that agrofuels as typical cash crops will hurt small farmers and peasants. However, I think it is important to emphasize that efficient and integrated and decentralized bioenergy and advanced concepts of using this bioenergy, biogas, and so on, you name it, is an important component of local development, and this is especially important to prevent further destruction of forests as fuel would. So that is the situation today. When you look at the right chart, the white part represents how much of US corn is converted into ethanol, and I think it is a major part, even though agrofuels don't show as a massive component at this moment when you look at the overall picture of land use yet. And the food riots we had last year are actually a result of an increasing dependency and immediate impact of the oil price on food prices. And I think, as we've heard, the oil crisis, most of us would probably welcome the oil crisis to continue. One of the imperatives, of the ecological imperatives of this planet is a steep increase of oil prices. But if, and as to the extent that oil prices determine food prices in the future, it will be a catastrophe for billions of poor and not well-off people worldwide, especially urban people who are not in the focus of hunger at this moment, but of course much more than rural people depend on the present food prices. So the conclusion of the IASTD has been that business as usual is not an option, and that is represented in a short list of graphs. Basically, doubling the world's cereal production came at the expense of quadrupling freshwater use and quadrupling the input of artificial fertilizer, tripling pesticide application, and increasing per capita meat production by 60%. This obviously is the trick, the so-called Green Revolution success of the past 40 years, that you can only do once on this planet. We don't have a second planet to fulfill the needs of some people arguing that we need to double agricultural output again over the next 40 years. Not by these means. And also, I think it is important, this is the official figure of the IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change, on the share of agriculture on overall global greenhouse gas emissions by humans. But then, when you look in more detail, you will find that in many other sectors, a big part of the use is also directly food-related, and that leads us to the conclusion that over 40% of our total greenhouse gas emissions are actually directly food and agricultural production related. It should be at the focus on any new negotiations of the Kyoto Protocol. Unfortunately, so far it has been more or less neglected. And our present efficiency rate to produce 1 calorie of food with around 10 calories of fossil fuel, which means we are eating oil, is probably the main point to address. Reducing and finally abolishing fossil fuel dependency of agricultural production is probably the most important global major step towards a greenhouse gas neutral food production. And the biggest resource clearly is to reduce our waste and losses. This is a figure that the UNEP, shortly after the IASTD report, depicted, but you can find it in the report as well, which basically says that from 4,600 kilocalories produced on the field, only 2,000 kilocalories, less than half, arrive at the table. And the major points of losses is on one side post-harvest losses. About 30 to 40% of the cereal production in India, for instance, is rotting after harvest before ever seeing a customer. And then the second biggest and major I've already talked about is the conversion of cereals into meat. And the third is our food waste. Between 30 and 50%, the estimates vary, of all the food that is produced in the US, and more or less the same amount, or maybe a little less, in Europe, is thrown away. 10% of the household waste in Germany consists of unopened food. It directly goes into the bin. These are the major future potentials of reducing our impact. And what this report says, and I think that is important, and in a way it is revolutionary, probably not in this auditorium, but certainly at the UN level, is that in order to change this, we fully have to concentrate on the small farmers. This is an overview on how big an average farm is in different parts of the world, and it says that in Asia and Africa, which constitutes 87% of all farms of the world, it is around 4 acres. And this is where these farms are. And this is also a map, basically, of where hunger prevails at the same time. Now, how do we overcome this? I have to finish soon, sorry. I think the key concept is the concept of multifunctionality. Farms and agriculture do not only produce food. This is the vast misperception that has led us in these problems. The more food per hectare, the better. Increase the production and you will solve the problem. No, we don't. Farms produce food, they produce non-food, they maintain ecosystems, they maintain health, they maintain social structures, they keep the culture of a country alive, and they also play an enormous role in our spiritual heritage. And as long as we don't reward farmers for all these services, and that is an important message, we will run into more and more problems. And an interesting concept of this IASTD has been that this is not that new. This is the Andean cosmovision of the farm. There are communities of nature, communities of humans, and communities of gods and deities. Today, this would probably, in our modern society, be science and business. Only when they all merge together, they will create a healthy farmland, a healthy farm plot, and a healthy community And so the key messages are small farmers and rural development are the key to overcome hunger and poverty sustainably. We need an agroecological and efficiency revolution. The multifunctionality of agriculture must be fully appreciated and rewarded. Food sovereignty should be the guiding principle. I don't have the time to dwell on this further. Food safety is not enough as a concept. Women actually make the difference when investing in small farms worldwide, investing in women's rights, in women's education, and in women's access to basic resources, land, credit, political access, basically yields at least twice, if not 3 times, the results of investing the same amount in males. We need more research, yes, but it must be public research and participatory research which works with the farmers and not for the farmers, and which complements local and traditional knowledge. And finally, the key message, I think, is hunger and poverty will not be overcome by increasing overall production, but only through access to resources and food at the point of need. Now, I'm really driving you nervous. I leave all the policy options out, also my personal experience with small farmers, just to say that I think if we don't reconnect, as I'm trying to depict it in this picture, between the different experiences of food, if we don't realize that the size of our average garden is about the average size of 2 billion farmers of this world's livelihoods, then we probably make a big mistake. And this is also the big chance I see. And what is important to understand is fighting hunger and poverty is not a technical problem, it's a question of political will. And this is from the last war, you're probably familiar with this. This is a more actual concept, and I thank you very much for your patience. And here are the websites where you will find more about this IASTD report.
Maybe actually you can take a seat. Thank you so much, Benny, for this wonderful overview. Can I actually ask the other speakers to come up? We don't have another PowerPoint, so we can turn off the PowerPoint and open up the lights, and I'll ask the others. But thank you very much for that overview, which I think has raised a whole host of questions that we need to seriously think about, that we will think about not only in this panel, but in subsequent panels, for example, questions of climate change. I was particularly glad that you mentioned water. Because the future of food is intricately linked to the future of water. Let me move on to forward that conversation and call upon Tim Wise, a friend and a colleague of many years. He's at Tufts University at a place called GDE, the Global Institute for Environment and Development at Tufts, does work on a number of these integrated issues, trying to put these issues together of food, including food with a whole host of other issues. So, Tim, all yours.
Thank you. It's great to be here, and I really appreciate the invitation from the folks at BU to participate in this. It's certainly timely and I think we're at a moment in the debate on food where there may actually be some openings and some possibilities for change. Benny's presentation, I think, highlights the IASTD report is a remarkable achievement on its own, but what it represents as an attempt to break with a paradigm for agriculture and food production that has dominated public policy for decades is perhaps even more significant. Before I start my talk, I wanted to announce, the organizers have asked me to tell you that they've canceled lunch. Actually, no, but those in the, but I do want to talk about the food crisis, and the food crisis for about 100 to 150 million people in the world, the spike in food prices actually did result in the canceling of lunch, not one day, but every day for the foreseeable future. That's the estimate of how many people the food price spikes of 2007 and 8 drove into hunger. Benny ran through some of the numbers on the levels of hunger in the world today, nearly 1 billion worldwide. An entirely embarrassing 57 million in the United States. And the poverty numbers, which again, I think are just worth keeping in mind, we're talking about 3 billion people estimated to be in poverty, 1.4 billion in extreme poverty, and that's up 400 million since the cascading crises of recent years. It's not about to get better anytime soon. Because my old colleague Jim Harkness from Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy says he's going to cover all the really important things, like explaining the food crisis and explaining why prices went up and explaining why they came back down. I don't have to. So instead, I'm going to take this opportunity to talk a little bit more. I was asked to give a little bit more of a global perspective, although I don't know how I can get more global than Benny. But to try to give a little bit more of a global perspective, offer some concepts that might be useful in understanding the intersection of the globalization with food and agriculture. And to talk about, the point I really want to make is that the food crisis isn't just about, or the recent food crisis that we saw isn't just about the end of cheap food, as it's been framed here, but it's actually caused by the pursuit of cheap food itself. And I'll explain that. I mean, how does cheap food cause hunger? That doesn't make sense, right? If food is cheaper, it's more affordable, and more people should be able to eat an adequate diet. But that's obviously not true if you're growing the food. You're not getting a decent price for what you're growing. If you don't believe that, ask, Vermont dairy farmers today. You could ask Vermont dairy farmers how they're doing with prices that are about half of what it costs to produce milk. Going out of business is how they're doing, and they're certainly not eating better in the process either. But as Benny pointed out, half of the world's poor, I guess you had the IASTD uses the number of 70% of the world's poor are in rural areas and dependent either directly or indirectly on agriculture. So if prices are low and you're not getting money for your crops, then cheap food is not making you eat better, it's making you eat worse. But beyond that, if prices stay so low for so long, and that's been the result of the prevailing policies that we've seen, then you're not only starving farmers, you're starving agricultural investment. And that is where long-term improvements in food will come. All of these recent reports, the attention that the IASTD report, are really a sign of change, or at least hope. Hope and change. That's where we are in the world today. A lot of hope, and we're hoping for a lot of change. That's going to take some work. It's not just IASTD. The FAO has started coming out with some more interesting things. The Commission on Sustainable Development of the UN has published some interesting material on the right to food as a guiding concept. The UN Commission Committee on Trade and Development, UNCTAD, has done a lot of work on the commodities crisis and speculation. IASTD is really the breakthrough report, I think. An interesting bellwether of this change, though, was the World Bank's own World Development Report in 2008, which was called Agriculture for Development, which was the first publication, first time the bank had focused its bellwether publication on agriculture in 25 years. And the neglect went way beyond the editorial pages of that report. The neglect went to World Bank policies themselves, which for all of the attention in this report, and some of it very good and certainly welcome, to the need to reinvest in agriculture and agriculture's role in stimulating dynamic economic development in the developing world, the bank studiously avoided taking any responsibility at all for having promoted the very policies that caused agriculture to be neglected in the first place. Not just that the World Bank itself cut its own loans for agricultural development dramatically in that same 25-year period. Worse than that, their policies and their loans were conditioned on structural adjustment programs, economic restructuring that pushed for the state, the government, to pull back from its role in the economy, a role that in agriculture has been absolutely critical over the years. The argument was that the market should be allowed to work its magic, to allocate resources more efficiently, and to set prices, and have everyone in the economy respond more to those price signals. The goal was to get the government out of agriculture. In agriculture, what that looks like, this theory of comparative advantage, which you've probably all heard about, is that if you can't produce basic grains as efficiently, and what efficiently means in the global world, in the globalized world, is as cheaply as they can in the United States, as they can in Australia, or as they can in Brazil, maybe you just shouldn't produce any more basic grains. Instead, maybe you should produce, what, flowers for export. Maybe you should produce, if you're lucky, you could produce some winter strawberries for the US market. But maybe you shouldn't produce anything, because maybe your land is so bad, and maybe there's really nothing the market wants from you because we can get the cheap grains you were growing from abroad. Maybe you should go take a job in a factory producing, sewing garments together. But actually there aren't many of those. So maybe you should go to the coast and get a job changing sheets in the new and expanding tourist industry, where your country maybe does have a slight comparative advantage. And that's really how the theory works. The idea is that that a country can import all the food it needs, and it should, if it can get it cheaper from abroad than it would investing in growing it by its own farmers. The problems with that, of course, are that in this global model, there aren't enough jobs. So if somebody did decide they wanted to leave the land and go search for better opportunities, there aren't any, or there are very few. And that's why you see Mexicans flowing across the border in record numbers, despite the increasing danger of doing so since NAFTA was implemented. There just haven't been enough jobs generated by what has been otherwise a tremendously successful expansion of trade, investment. On all those measures, NAFTA worked for Mexico. They got everything they wanted except development and jobs. But second, for a country, the problem with this theory is that you can end up in a situation of food dependency. And food dependency becomes particularly problematic when prices spike and when supplies get tight. And that's what we saw last year and the year before with what became known as the food crisis. Prices spiked, which had more to do with the rest of the financial bubble bursting than people generally acknowledge. Hopefully Jim will talk some about that. But supplies got tight. It actually truly became hard to find all all the food you needed. So countries like the Philippines were basically saying they were willing to pay any price they could to get rice for their people, because they'd stopped producing enough rice following these dictates and these policies. And they couldn't get anybody to sell it to them, because people were hanging on. Thailand was hanging on to it. Indonesia's hanging on to it for its own population. So it exposed the dangers of following policies that say you can get all the cheap food you need out on the international market and focus on your comparative advantage and other things. A lot of countries have taken note of that. But the country that I've done most research on is Mexico, and I have to say the Mexican government doesn't seem to have taken note of this at all. The Mexican people certainly have, though. Mexico experienced this in a dramatic way, because here in the birthplace of corn, where corn was domesticated, where the center of origin for one of the world's most important food crops, you had tortilla riots in the streets as people couldn't afford tortillas because prices had spiked. This, a country where 2 million farmers had left the land since the North American Free Trade Agreement was signed. And the Mexican government and the US government followed policies that resulted in a shift in the emphasis from Mexico growing its own corn with its own mostly smaller scale farmers with government support to the government backing away, letting the free market work its magic, and corn much cheaper from the United States pouring into Mexico at 3 to 5 times the rate, depending on what base year you use to measure it from. Mexico now depends for about, I think it's 25% of its corn on the United States. That cheap corn has had its intended effects. It's produced cheap food, in theory. At least it's produced cheap corn. It drove corn prices down 50% in real terms, adjusted for inflation, in Mexico right after NAFTA. With the government pulling back, that left farmers much hungrier than they were before, and with a much more precarious decision to make about what they could and couldn't afford to do. They started exporting family members to try to make a living, and and many of them have stayed on the farm and tried to keep producing corn. So Mexico's corn production, it's a resilient culture and a resilient system. They haven't lost the capacity to produce corn, but they've lost a lot of the strength of their own food producing capacity. What this illustrates, and this is the one key concept I wanted to leave you with, is what we've called the globalization of market failure. The globalization process actually involves opening markets and bringing things that are produced in different parts of the world into direct competition with each other. The assumption, and there are actual explicit assumptions in economics about this, are that those markets work, that prices actually reflect the real values of what's being traded. When they don't, economists call it a market failure. And agriculture is absolutely rife with market failures. You can see it in Mexico in the corn markets, in the Mexico-US trade in corn, because the assumption is that efficiency means high yield means low price, and the price reflects the actual value of what's produced. Well, what if Mexican farmers aren't getting the credit that people get in the United States because of failures in the financial markets? What if they don't have the same infrastructure? What if they don't have the same access to public investment in, say, irrigation technology? What if intermediaries control those financial markets? And what if transnational firms that operate on both sides of the border are the buyers for all of the corn that's being produced in North America, and they can play producers off against each other. These are not perfectly functioning markets, and they are rife with market failures, which is the role governments have played, is to step in and try to correct for failures of the market so that producers and consumers are both protected. Environmental costs are one of the key areas where the market fails to value, and the most widely acknowledged, I think, where the market fails to adequately value both costs and benefits. In the case of corn, corn is one of the most polluting U.S. crops. Excessive water use, excessive chemical use, runoff of fertilizers into waterways, the dead zone at the mouth of the Mississippi River in the Gulf of Mexico, the size of the state of New Jersey, are examples of high environmental costs from U.S. corn production. Producers and traders pay virtually none of the costs of those damages, so that the price of corn at the marketplace in the United States and at the marketplace when it goes across the border into Mexico does not reflect those costs. In that sense, those are called externalities. Economists call those externalities, negative externalities in that case. What happens on the Mexican side? Well, among the smaller producers who are producing widely biodiverse varieties of corn, maintaining the biodiversity of that system with low input systems, sustainable water use, with climate benefits because they're keeping hillsides from eroding, et cetera, et cetera. There are a set of positive externalities. But does the market reflect those positive externalities? Does the market actually award a higher price that significantly recognizes the stewardship of the land, the value of the biodiversity? Look, corn biodiversity has zero value in the global marketplace, absolutely zero value. You can't point to a single way, except in some local markets where there's cultural attributes that people will pay for, that the global marketplace recognizes the value of diversity in corn. And yet these corn seeds are at the absolute building block for future varieties of corn that can resist climate change and that crop breeders absolutely rely on. Do the crop breeders have to pay for them? No, they're in the public domain. They're in seed banks. So this is a classic case of a positive contribution of generations of Mexican and other farmers who have maintained this biodiversity and get absolutely nothing for it. And in theory, in the global marketplace, the price should reflect that. Market failures prevent that from reflecting it. So that what you get, that when you liberalize trade, is you get the globalization of market failure. You get polluting U.S. corn exported to Mexico at prices that don't reflect those costs. So underpriced corn coming into direct competition with undervalued Mexican corn. Who loses? Mexican corn loses, not necessarily because it's not, quote unquote, efficient. As one Mexican farmer was quoted famously saying, we've been producing corn in Mexico for 8,000 years. If we don't have a comparative advantage in that, where do we have a comparative advantage? And it's a really good point, but it highlights that comparative advantage defined by the marketplace, the global marketplace, doesn't value the kinds of advantages that Mexican corn offers. They are not reflected in the marketplace. The impact of the globalization of market failure is a worsening environment, increasing poverty among food producers, decreasing investment in wealth does not accumulate in the countryside among farmers. It increases food dependence. It makes the country as a whole more vulnerable to price shocks like we saw in the food crisis. And it's in that sense that the food crisis is as much a product of cheap food as much as it is a sign of the possible end of cheap food. There is a wonderful study, and I'll leave you with this, that some very dedicated agricultural researchers in Mexico have worked for years to try to get the Mexican government to treat its corn farmers as the resource that they are, rather than as the anachronism they seem to be seen as. Antonio Torrent has done calculations that using existing technology, not GM technology, but just existing technology, Mexico could double the amount of corn it produces simply by infrastructure improvements, moving some public lands out of extensive cattle grazing and into intensive maize production, and irrigation in areas where there's abundant water and where there's no irrigation technology built. Those areas are in the poorest parts of the country, so it would have a social benefit. What would it take to do that? It would take public investment from the Mexican government, public investment from the international community, and most importantly, it would take protection. It would take the government saying, to allow this to happen, to make this process profitable, for that corn to be profitable, we can't just keep importing the cheap corn from the United States and having it displace our own corn. We're going to have to put in place tariffs or other forms of protection. What's the problem with that? NAFTA makes it illegal, which is why and this is the point I want to leave you with, a good definition of globalization that I like to use is the cheapening of everything. There are things that you're all here today, I assume, because you know that there are some things that just shouldn't be cheapened, that letting the market's really good at setting values for a lot of things, but it's not good at setting our own human values, and we should be setting our own human values and telling the market what we want from it. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim. Thanks very much for raising those very important points. In some ways, it was striking that the conclusion of the last two speakers was actually exactly the same, that it's a question not just of food, but of political will, that unless you tackle that, you won't get anywhere. Let me move on to our third speaker, and we do want to hear from the audience, even though we are running a little behind. But it's a great pleasure to have here at BU with us Jim Harkness, who is the president of the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy, one of the, if not the preeminent institute doing research on these issues here in the US. Jim, all yours.
Thanks very much. And that's www.iatp.org. We actually have a few recent reports that I think are very relevant to some of the conversations we had. One on really clarifying what the research tells us about agriculture and climate change, it's something like measuring our food print or something, but it's really a tremendous summary that clarifies some of these issues around, food miles and the relationship between these issues. And another one that talks in detail about the relationship between commodity speculation and food security, which Tim mentioned was a key trigger for the so-called food crisis. I am the last speaker, the kind of cleanup speaker for the morning, and my remarks will be shorter than I thought they would be because I've spent the last few talks going through my remarks and crossing out, okay, can't talk about Mexico. Tim talked about Mexico. Don't need to talk about deregulation. And there's, IASTD? Okay, Benny handled that. We were actually, one of our staff was a co-author, and I would like to say that the ISTAD, or IASTD, to me, it functions a little bit like the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change did for climate. That finally you've got this critical mass of researchers and governments from around the world that are saying, small agriculture, sustainable agriculture, this is not This is not fringe science or something that, that elites or hippies are advocating. This is something that has to be the future of food for the whole world if we actually want to feed everybody. So I really can't recommend enough that you follow the link that Benny showed you and try to pick your way through this incredibly thick report, because they're diplomatic and scientific to a T, so sometimes it's hard to find some of the conclusions, but it's really fantastic stuff, and I think an important basis for moving forward. I do want to mention, to start out, that I was on the phone with a member of my board yesterday morning, and he's the head of the largest peasant organization in Mexico, and I asked him, so is the swine flu getting any better? And he said, what are you talking, the what? And I said, the swine flu. And he said, oh, here we call it the NAFTA flu. And I think based on what we've heard from Tim, you can imagine why that is. You can imagine, although the jury isn't in on the gigantic pig factory in Mexico where the first cases were recorded, the fact is that Smithfield was able to locate there and wanted to locate there because NAFTA gave them the opportunity to move out of the United States to a place where labor was cheaper, where there wouldn't be enforcement of environmental laws, and where they could essentially import cheap American corn to feed their pigs. So call it NAFTA flu. Don't give the pigs a bad name. Another thing that I'd like to talk about, and I really have been kind of trying to rearrange my remarks. This panel is called The End of Cheap Food, and really was initially thought of as the end of cheap food is a bad thing because it threatens food security. But I think all three of us feel like we really need to be aware of the dual meaning of cheap. And I think, again, Tim said it very well. So I'd like to talk mostly about food security and the food crisis, but also about the other aspect and the human cost of what truly cheap food has been here in the United States. The notion of calling it a food crisis, I think, is itself a little bit of a problem, because by definition, a crisis is something that nobody could have predicted, and something that's temporary. And I think what we're seeing instead with the food crisis is actually something that, if you were paying attention over the last 30 years, is something that would have been pretty easy to predict, and that many of us were saying was inevitable. And again, thinking back on the speakers that we've heard all morning, starting with Satish, I think that ultimately everything you're going to hear today about problems in the food system come down to two forms of reductionist thinking. One of them is the notion that growing food is the same thing as industrial manufacturing, right? It's like making widgets, and we need to use fossil fuels and aim for efficiency at all costs to raise productivity of crops, and that's how we guarantee that we have enough food for everyone. The other form of reductionist thinking is the notion that food's primary role or its exclusive value is as a tradable commodity, and that by unleashing markets and having a free exchange of food as a commodity, that's the most efficient way, again, to make sure that food is allocated in society. Those two ways of thinking, the ideologies behind them, and the motions that they set in place over the last half century, especially, really have been the big drivers that I think have inevitably led to the food crisis that we've seen in the last year and a half. In more particular terms, I would say over the last 30 years, of course, the process of industrializing food globally, one of the most important elements of that was the Green Revolution. And the Green Revolution, without question, increased the amount of food that was available on the planet tremendously in the 1960s and 70s. The problem is that it mostly did that by substituting fossil fuel and fossil sunlight and fossil water for rainwater and surface water and real-time present-day sunlight. So it was a matter of pumping water out of aquifers, which was not renewable, and it was a matter of using chemical fertilizers derived from fossil fuels, pesticides, mechanized machinery, and ultimately, most recently, genetically modified crops. And what what I'm sure Satish could tell us more about is the initial success story of the Green Revolution were states in India like Punjab, where there were bumper harvests, and there was a celebration of the fact that perhaps the days of famine were gone forever. Well, now, 25, 30 years later, precisely those areas are the areas where groundwater is polluted, farmers are committing suicide in record numbers. There is actually, even the state governments are turning away from the notion of green revolution and saying that they need to try something different. The notion that science and technology and industrial farming will save us is very deep-rooted. And of course, one of the responses to the food crisis, whether it was from Jeffrey Sachs or from experts from financial institutions, was that we need a new green revolution. And the Gates Foundation is funding a new green revolution for Africa to the tune of billions of dollars that is essentially taking those unsustainable industrial notions of agriculture and trying to apply them in a place where they've been tried before and already failed. In terms of the economic side of the coin, of food as a commodity and freeing markets, and Helena talked about deregulation. The last 30 years have been very much about an agenda that most people call neoliberal economics, the Washington Consensus, market fundamentalism. And again, I won't go into too much detail because Tim talked about it, but both the United States and the World Bank and to a large extent Europe have promoted the notion that markets work much more efficiently than governments, and that the best way to guarantee food security is really for countries to follow their comparative example, their comparative advantage. An important component of that, as Tim mentioned, was not just persuading, but forcing developing country governments to forego state support for agriculture, whether that might be subsidies for fertilizers, agricultural extension systems and research, or in fact, government-held food reserves that could be used in a time of famine. According to the market fundamentalist ideology, that is market distortion. If a government can release food to feed its people at any time, where is the incentive for entrepreneurs to invest in those markets so that they may make a profit? And how is the market going to reach the equilibrium that it requires? And so when the so-called food crisis or the food price crisis hit in 2000 and 2008, many food stocks around the world were at their lowest levels since the 1970s, and some of them since the late 1940s. And so this was a result of trying to apply the sort of on-time production mentality of industrial manufacturing of the 90s and 2000s to food production, and it led to a system that was incredibly unstable and vulnerable to external pressures. These are systems, the free trade, deregulated trade system, and the notion of industrial agriculture that on their own terms, in some cases, and especially in ideal conditions, can deliver tremendous prosperity and tremendous yields, for instance. But the problem is that they're incredibly fragile, and what they lack is the resilience that you find, for instance, in natural ecosystems and in many traditional agricultural systems. And if you were in a world where there weren't a lot of external perturbations and there wasn't a lot of volatility, these are systems that might be able to persist for some time without problems. But the world we live in is, in fact, one in which, in part because of the very types of policies that I've described, has become actually more volatile, where there are more possibilities for instability than in a very long time. And there are several forms of volatility out there that contributed to basically triggering what is known as the food crisis. One of them is the fact that climate and weather has grown much more unstable over the last 20 years. The IPCC tells us, and many of you probably know, that 2005 and 1998 were the two hottest years on record since 1850, when records started to be kept, the two hottest years worldwide. And there's been a huge increase since the 1970s in the occurrence of extreme weather events of all kind, whether droughts or storms or heat waves. And so on the one hand, we have greater instability of weather, which of course agriculture is tremendously dependent on. On the other hand, global financial systems and the prices of global commodities have become progressively more unstable. And a lot of that is, of course, due to conscious policies that we've been learning about over the last year, that were put in place initially in the United States, again, in order to generate more prosperity by reducing the barriers to entrepreneurship and developing new instruments. And I have a number of copies of our paper on the role of commodity speculation in triggering the food price crisis that I can share with people. You can also download it from the website, which again is www.iatp.org. So, I mean, in short, it really shouldn't have been a surprise to anyone when there has been a chain or a long row of dominoes in finance and investment, really going back to the 1980s. Does anyone remember the S&L crisis in the 1980s? Well, there's really a family tree that stretches from the S&L crisis to the whole variety of bubbles that we've seen, the dot-com bubble, and down to the real estate bubble. And when capital began flooding out of real estate in 2006 and 2007, it needed somewhere new to go. And where it went was to indexed commodity funds. So the increase in the price of oil and the increase in the price of food was not because there was a drought in Australia. And frankly, it wasn't, for the most part, even just because of animal production or biofuels. A lot of it was basically produced by speculation. And produced by speculation that not only raised the price of food, even when food was there, people therefore were not able to afford it, but it also drastically increased the price of the petroleum products that food production was dependent on. So we really had a crisis that was an artifact of a financial system that had been turned into a house of cards for the sake of maximizing the profits of a small number of corporations in the United States. And I think one of the things to keep in mind, and one of the part of the evidence for why this was the nature of the food crisis, that it wasn't some the fact that we have too many people on the planet to feed, or that there were problems with weather, is to look at the countries that suffered the most and the countries that were relatively untouched by the food crisis. It was developing countries, and by 2008, over 2/3 of developing countries were net food importers as a result of the policies that I was talking about. It was those countries that followed the advice of the United States and the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund and pursued their comparative advantage that were the countries that faced food riots and in some cases governments falling and many more people left hungry because of the food crisis. On the other hand, let's look at China, for instance. China is a huge country, and it has grown very rapidly. Their consumption of meat has also increased tremendously in the last 2 decades. But China, although there were some increases in the price of pork, most staple food prices remain stable, and China was able to get through the crisis pretty much unscathed. The reason for this is that although China is thought of as this freewheeling free market country, and although there are a lot of problems with China's food system, don't get me wrong, I actually lived in China for 16 years working on environment and rural development issues. But the fact is, China also has a deep cultural, political, and social understanding that food is not just a tradable commodity that should be used for profit. There's a deep understanding, even among China's leaders, that ultimately food security is something that the state needs to pay attention to, and that needs to be given a much higher priority than profits or trade. Therefore, China has a whole range of policies that were able to insulate it from global price hikes. China has an export dependency ratio that requires that 95% of their staple grain for domestic consumption be produced domestically. And therefore, their dependence on imports was, except for the case of soy, has been extremely limited and remains so. They have a policy that outlaws the growing of biofuel feedstocks on arable land that can be used for food crops. They have strong policies for supporting agriculture in the form of subsidies for fertilizers, support for agricultural extension, and they have an amazing, although it's a state secret, they have an amazing food reserve system. China actually has, we talk about the strategic petroleum reserve we have in the United States. China has, not only do they have rice and maize and all of these other grains, China has a strategic pork reserve. So when the price of pork went up in late 2007, early 2008, actually as a result of a disease problem more than the food price crisis, the government was literally able to say, you know, release the pork from the reserves, and the prices came back down, and so China really, by having very basic policies in place and ignoring the advice of mainstream economists and the Western world, has been able to really insulate its economy and society from the food price crisis. And I think there's a lot to be learned from that. And there are actually cases in Africa as well. Ethiopia, in Benny's slide, was one of the few developing countries where the amount of available food increased over the last 5 years. And that's because of specific policies they had in place to guarantee food security in the face of opposition from international financial institutions and American advisors. The same thing is true of Malawi, and there are some other cases in West Africa that you could point to. So the food crisis is something that countries that have understood that food is not just something that should be traded, but is something that people need to survive, have been able to avoid it. And I think that's, again, a very hopeful sign for the future, the fact that there are policy options that states can follow. I just want to conclude with two short anecdotes about the cost of cheap food here in the United States. I want to bring it back to our own country. One of my other board members is a restaurateur, and on career day at an inner city high school in Minneapolis, she was one of the speakers, and the other speaker after her, she was telling the students about how they should eat healthy food and they should garden and all of the wonderful things that we talked about today. And you know, their eyes glazed over a little bit, and they said, well, what about McDonald's? And they weren't that engaged. Well, the person after her worked in the prosthetics industry. And she said, you know, you might think about future career choices in the prosthetics industry. And she lined up 10 of the students in the front of the room, and she said, 6 of you are going to get diabetes, and 3 of you are going to need prosthetic limbs. And it's because of what you're eating in the cafeteria at the school. And so you should really think about a career in prosthetics. I think she made the point a little better than my board member about the real cost of cheap food in America. The other scary story that I heard from a friend in Ohio was about the town next to hers. You know, Ohio is the Rust Belt. They've been deindustrialized and are really hurting worse than a lot of the rest of the country. Well, you know, these towns go to great lengths to try to attract industries, sometimes from other countries, sometimes from other parts of the country. So they were trying to lure a company into building a plant in their town. And they gave them a huge tax break, and they zoned an area for them that was right on the river, and they gave them all these statistics about how wonderful and educated and skilled their workforce was, and how low wages were in their town, and they didn't get the factory. And they called the company and said, you know, we understand your decision, but we'd really like to know why, because, you know, we're desperate and we want to attract economic development. And the company said, we loved your town, and we love the tax breaks and all the things you were going to do to attract us here. But our insurers told us that the rate of childhood obesity in your community is so high that there would be no way for us to provide health insurance for the workers if we cited our plant in your town. And so in terms of competitiveness for this town, childhood obesity, which is in very large part a result of the cheap food that's available for working people in this country, is a competitiveness issue. It's not just even about children's health, it's an economic development issue. And so I hate to leave you on such a downer, but let's go have lunch now. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. I was going to say thank you for leaving us with those wonderful images right before lunch. Vivian, we'll have some extra food left after these stories, it seems. In fact, I hope we'll have extra food left. We've had 3 very comprehensive, very interesting discussions. We don't have as much time left for Q&A as we'd hoped for, but we do have some. And I'm going to ask the organizers if we can at least take the 5 minutes that we started late to give those of you in the audience at least some ability to comment. And do please keep your comments brief. There are 2 mics here. If people can line up, we'll take a bunch of comments and then maybe have a minute each. And a minute is 60 seconds, guys, for responses. Lady at the back.
I wish somebody could fill in something that we heard very briefly on a CBC report about something where in Africa there was a huge tract of land that was being given to grow biofuel, 99-year lease or something, and the prime agricultural land was going to be given to this. Have you heard anything about this?
Gentlemen, we'll take a bunch of comments and questions and come to our panel, so please take notes on which you might be able to answer. Gentleman in the front, sir.
Yeah, I was thinking about Mae West's comment that it takes a lot of money to look this cheap. And we heard about the inefficiencies of agricultural subsidies in Europe this morning. I'd just like a better sense of how much money is being spent to produce cheap food and how it might better be invested.
Yeah, this goes to the externalities point that Tim was also making. Lady at the back?
Asking for your thoughts on how to prevent a repetition of the Green Revolution.
How to prevent the Green Revolution. Yes,
and I also wanted to know, we're talking about cheap food, but if we want to internalize all these costs, we need to make it more expensive. But then what's going to happen with the people who can't afford food?
Yeah, which goes to the 2 last presentations especially. Do we have any others before we open up to our panel? Okay. Any of you can take that, and especially on the first one, I don't know if it's about for biofuels or not, but there's a lot of land being bought not only in Africa but also in Asia by Middle Eastern and other countries, including China actually, for this issue of what they see as a looming food need, whether it's a food need or an agricultural need. But anyone? Benny, you want to start? Any of those?
It is a development of great concern. The FAO raised this issue recently. For anyone who wants to go into detail, the best website I know of is called grain.org. They have released extensive reports about different types of land grab, as they call it. And the intentions are mixed. It is not all for agrofuels, even though a lot of it goes or is intended to go to agrofuels. It is also for the food security. For instance, China is trying to get control over land to increase their own food security. There are discussions about this, also to what extent this was actually a welcome investment in the rural economy of the countries affected. And I think we will see a lively debate about it. Obviously, one thing to keep in mind also in that respect is the tendency of a link between oil price and land price, which is a frightening perspective. And maybe I can just go to this other question on what will happen with the people who can't afford this food in this context. I think it is, we have an interesting discussion over and over again in Berlin about people living on Hartz IV, it's called, on social welfare. How much money do you actually need to feed yourself healthy? And there are plenty of proofs out now that you can live well, healthy, at something around 4 to 5 euro a day, which is provided by social welfare. However, it requires you to have the know-how to buy the food at the right place and to process the food and cook it, right? Obviously, if you want to have healthy food in a convenience store, you will be in trouble as a recipient of social welfare. And another example I always find really striking is in the region I come from, around Berlin. Before the wall came down, about 35% of the entire fresh produce were provided by private gardens in the region, because of the failure of the system. There is a huge potential in growing your own food. And I think this is something to really look at and not ridicule. And so I think there are many, many ways where you will not be dependent on having more cash as food prices rise.
I won't try to take on all of those, but let me just make a couple comments on responding to two in particular. To follow up on Benny's point about how do you, if food is going to be, if we need to be paying more for food, what about the poor? There's two parts of that. One is more of the food dollar needs to get to the farmer. And what we're saying is that farmers need to receive a sustainable amount of money. In fact, one of the most dramatic trends in recent years has been the intermediaries, the processors, and the input suppliers, seeds, fertilizers, et cetera, capturing a much, much, much higher share of the food dollar and much less getting to the farm. So part of it is trying to make sure that farmers are actually getting more of our food dollar. That means that in the end, the food that you're having to buy isn't actually that much more expensive. It's as expensive as it is today, partly because of all that processing and all the intermediaries that are handling it. But the other is that among the things that are being cheapened in the world today, besides food, are labor. And so the food crisis is really an income crisis. It's not a food availability crisis. It's also not a crisis of the price of food. It's a crisis of the value of labor. It's a crisis in how much we pay, how much we are willing to pay for and demand that people receive for honest work, and to make sure that people who want to work have work. That concept used to be called work with dignity. Has been largely lost from the discussion, and it has to re-enter the discussion, or you're never going to solve the food crisis, which, like I said, is an income crisis. One quick response on the question about agricultural subsidies, which is obviously way too big a topic to get into in 2 minutes before lunch. But I just wanted to say that groups like the National Family Farm Coalition and IATP, among others, have been campaigning for a long time to try to draw attention to the fact that that really the problem in the U.S. Agricultural system isn't simply that subsidies are causing the problem. It's that the absence of appropriate agricultural policies are causing the problem. And those agricultural policies are ones that used to do a moderately good job of balancing supply with demand so there wasn't overproduction of key crops, because no individual farmer was going to hold back their grain from the market, and there was a tendency toward overproduction and low prices. The subsidy system feeds that. A more sensible set of government policies actually puts it in check, balances supply and demand, shoots for prices that are remunerative for farmers and affordable for consumers. That's the kind of reasonable policy that many governments have followed, the U.S. government has tried to follow in the past, and that has been abandoned in the deregulation era.
Thank you. Before I come to Jim, both of you have made this argument that cheap food does not necessarily benefit the poor, and I think it's a very important point which is often lost. I think the converse question being asked is, does expensive food necessarily hurt the poor? And what can we create as policies that will not do so, where in fact the benefit of more reasonably priced food actually goes down to those who are growing it? But any last comments on that or anything?
Oh, you stuck me with that one, huh? Well, I mean, I think that Tim's right, that there are more systemic issues around the structure of the economy. You know, if you restructure your economy so everybody gets a Walmart wage, then they're going to have to be able to shop at Walmart and buy their food there. So I think that there are some deeper systemic issues that need to be dealt with. On the other hand, I also think that it is a matter of, and not a matter of do you subsidize or not, but how can we change the subsidies so we're subsidizing the right things. One area of danger and opportunity, what do they call it on The Simpsons? Crisis-opportunity, is climate change. Because if we really take seriously the relationship between agriculture and climate change, and we shift to, instead of subsidizing industrial agriculture that's based on fossil fuels, to actually making green payments to farmers based on the multifunctionality of agriculture to help them to convert to agriculture that can sequester carbon and that can ensure that we have a clean water supply, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, then you have a source of revenue where you could make that where you could not just work at the margins of the food system on $4 heirloom tomatoes, but actually make the mainstream of the food system less expensive, not cheaper, but less expensive for everybody. And, you know, Kelly Brownell, somebody mentioned this brilliant guy, Kelly Brownell at Yale, who did the article about big food and big tobacco being similar. Well, he also talks about the fact that, you know, one of the responses to big tobacco that's been effective has been taxes on cigarettes. And they go through, from a public health perspective, the argument for a tax on sodas, saying if we had a penny an ounce tax on Coca-Cola and Mountain Dew, not only would it be a disincentive for people to buy these unhealthy things, but it could be fed back into anti-obesity programs and more sustainable agricultural programs, and would generate a tremendous amount of revenue. I think that, you know, those are the kinds of things that we also need to be thinking about in terms of how we can actually make more fundamental changes to the system.
Thank you very much. Before I thank our three panelists for very, very wonderful talks and some insightful discussion, which will continue during the rest of the day, a little plug, and then I'll just by way of saying all the other interesting things being done here at BU on food. We at the Pardee Center have been working on food as an issue. We have just released these three policy briefs. We have some copies here for those who might want them, and actually on Monday we'll be having a panel at the UN as part of the Commission on Sustainable Development, which is meeting this week on the issue of food. And our panel is headed by the Dutch Minister for Agriculture. So food is an issue that is of increasing importance, not just to us here at BU, but I think to a larger policy community. This may be a moment in food policy where people in other arenas have suddenly awoken to all the things that you all have been saying for a long time. The climate people have started rising to it for their own interests. The water people have started figuring out that there is this deep link here. The environment and sustainability people are, and now the markets are too. So for all those reasons, I think this is the time to have this discussion, and thank you very, very much to all three for this discussion.